Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will share strategies that agencies can implement to alleviate the concern about the unknown and make operations more efficient. My name is Kirsten Patton-Kotsaruba, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit organization that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees that are joining us from home today, and a special thanks to Lindsay Stalnacker and the entire Invicti team for helping us put on today's event. This afternoon, we will hear from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session where we will pop up a few poll questions and answer yours. That being said, before we begin, I really want to encourage the audience to please submit those questions of your own down below in the Q&A section of this platform. And don't forget to answer the poll questions in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits for today's event. Now, with all of that said, I would like to welcome our panelists to come on camera. There they are, and go ahead and come off mute because we are going to begin with a round of introductions. So please share with us who you are, what organization or agency you represent, what you do there, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience. Grant, let's start with you, please.
Sure, yeah, so thanks. So I'm Grant Dasher. I work in the Office of the Technical Director for Cybersecurity in CISA's Cybersecurity Division. And our responsibility is to provide technical support and assistance to CISA's initiatives and programs, as well as strategic direction on how we can execute CISA's various missions, one of which is helping agencies improve their cybersecurity posture, which is of course inclusive of work that we're talking about here today on ZTA and AppSec. My background is especially in cloud and identity, as well as some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today.
Thanks, Grant. Let's jump over to Bo next.
Hey, thank you, Kirsten. Bo Hauser, I'm the CISO for the U.S. Census Bureau. I've been there about 3 years. We're currently working to incorporate the federal direction that's happening around zero trust, identity, supply chain, and other cybersecurity priorities. And before Census, I was at the Small Business Administration as the CISO there. And then before that, I was the Deputy CISO over at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid.
Thank you, Bo. Over to you next, Martin.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Martin Stanley. I'm the Strategic Technology Branch Chief at CISA. And at CISA, my team works across these various CISA mission spaces to identify capability demands and then go execute R&D projects. And to that end, we work with Grant and all the folks in the Office of the Technical Director, particularly around zero trust, which is the topic of the day today. That has been long been identified as a capability demand for CISA. And we publish a strategic technology roadmap every year. And in this year, we've got an update where we have some details on the things that we're looking for and as a way of signaling demand to industry and to academia. Some things that we've been involved in at CISA on zero trust include the zero trust maturity model, which some of you might be familiar with, as well as extensive work with NIST on SP 800 207, which is the zero trust architecture. And I think one of the last things which is important to point out is, I came to CISA back in, which wasn't even CISA then, it was just DHS, Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, to work on what was called at the time the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, the CDM program, which is a very large government-wide effort to provide tools and capabilities to agencies that execute cybersecurity capabilities. And over that time, things have evolved and matured. And I think one of the things that we want to emphasize here today is that all these tools and capabilities that we put out there can all be leveraged as part of a zero trust architecture. You don't have to go buy new stuff. You don't have to go buy a new zero trust solution. You can use many of the capabilities that you already have. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then, of course, Ted.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Kirsten. And thanks for having me. So Ted Rudge, I'm the head of public sector here at Invicti. I've been with Invicti just over 2 years now, but I've got a long 25 plus year tenure delivering IT security solutions to the federal government. And for those of you who are not familiar with Invicti, we're an 18-year-old company that delivers modern application security, DevSecOps or SecDevOps, depending on how you refer to it, to the federal government. And what I hope to share with you today is a lot of feedback and best practices and lessons learned from our over 200 customers that we support today around how they're leveraging Zero Trust, both CISA's Zero Trust maturity model and the latest DoD Zero Trust roadmap, and give you some great feedback on what they're telling us.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. So in no particular order, I will go around and we'll have the first question answered, but I'll make sure to start with each of you first at some point throughout the discussion. So don't feel bad if you go last, you'll be able to go first at some point. Bo, let's start with you first though. I want to talk about what are the most common issues that agencies face when they set out to design a security strategy, and how can following the Zero Trust architecture guidelines help with this?
Yeah, the challenges are pretty stark. From a cybersecurity standpoint, we know that the bad guys get more and more creative day by day, and so it's hard to keep up. We also know that the technology landscape is advancing very quickly as well, and so it's hard to keep up, right? So it's really difficult across the board. And when you break it down into the specific areas, it's difficult as well. So you really got to focus on workforce as a way to keep up, just to keep up, right? And if you're gonna really make an impact, you got to have modern cybersecurity capabilities. For example, at Census, we combine a defense in depth, sort of the traditional approach to cybersecurity, with an intelligence-driven model, or some call it a threat-driven model, where we infuse intelligence into the processes so that we can prioritize, right? Because if there's an attack going on in the world that relates to your infrastructure in some way, you have to have a way to get that to the top of your stack to deal with that before other things, because there's just too much to keep up with across the board. So you got to have that prioritization happening. When it comes to Zero Trust, we're really hoping that we can change the landscape pretty dramatically. And the reason I say that is, the current model, which is really a defense in depth model, we've seen so often when that breaks down. And so cybersecurity programs today rely on incident response as a way to minimize harm when things do break down. We're really hoping that by combining, the identity pillar that's defined, identity being user, obviously, but also device identity, combining those two things together, along with attributes and other details we get from the session, like geographic location, that we're really able to raise the bar on cybersecurity. So you got to be the right person, you got to be on the device we expect you to be on, and you got to be coming from the location we expect you to come from. And if those things don't fall in line, you're denied, right? So it gives us many more tools in our toolbox to deal with the cyber threats. But it's also extremely flexible, right? So I think it's one of the few opportunities that we have in security to raise the bar on security and also improve user experience pretty dramatically too, if we get it right.
Absolutely. Thank you. Grant, I'd love to hear from you next on this.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think zero trust is a pretty big topic, right? I think some people say, well, don't know what it is. Well, I think at this point, various people have articulated, I think, definitions that maybe differ slightly in the details, but are all pretty consistent with each other. Our maturity model, the stuff coming out of the DoD, the stuff that gets published out of the analyst organizations, Forrester and Gartner, other kinds of things, all sort of converging around a similar set of ideas. which is to, stop having a single network where if you're on the network, you have access to anything and the defenses are trying to prevent you from getting on the network, but rather move to a place where there is, layers of defense in depth to prevent you from moving laterally. Now, part of the challenge, the title of today's webinar is a practical approach. Part of the challenge is, the infrastructure is changing very quickly, as Bo mentioned, and everyone who's ever done anything in IT has a legacy footprint to deal with. And I think, sometimes people sort of throw up their hands a little bit and say, well, I'm trapped in by my legacy footprint. I've got to do it this way. And I think, what we've started to see is some organizations have been able to find creative ways to, break out of the legacy box a little bit. Without re-architecting their entire network. And it's not easy, right? There's this is a complicated area, but I think figuring out ways to do that, minimize or at least sort of separate your legacy risk from your ability to develop infrastructure that is sort of aligned with these principles, that is leveraging identity, leveraging multi-factor authentication, leveraging dynamic risk analysis much deeper into the infrastructure than was previously the case. And frankly, that will require, certain sacred cows that have been, a pillar of the IT environment going back 20 years to be confronted in some cases. But I think it's not impossible. And I think it's really important that we, move in that direction. And we're seeing some really positive steps that are already being taken in the government community.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. And we'll definitely talk more about legacy technology as it relates to zero trust in just a moment. But Martin, is there anything you would like to add based on what you've heard so far?
Sure, thanks. The legacy technology side of this is really interesting, but one of the biggest challenges to just implementing security in general is making sure that you've got the policies in place and you've got the ability to enforce those across your users and your systems and all of that. And one of the things that I've observed both as running a security program and then also assisting folks in building out their security programs here at CISA is that a lot of times those policies aren't in place. The organizations don't really know who's accessing the data, or they don't really know who should have access to it, and how it's being used within the organization. So those are the kinds of things where you really have to leverage a lot of your mission side folks, who may not understand the technology, but can describe how the information and the resources are being used so that you can put in place the appropriate policies. And I think, I'm sure, the way, that we're talking about, capabilities at census, and earlier in this discussion, speak to, the needs that they have. It's obviously, they've got a really remote workforce and they're, all over the place. And so those are some of the capabilities that they're looking to get out of their solution.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Martin. And then Ted, let's hear your perspective from the industry side.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The, Bo and Grant and we've all brought up good comments already. The workforce and that cultural shift to move towards how our customers want help and help their existing resources to do more with less, right? I think the zero trust strategy outlines a lot of things in terms of introducing automation and integrating processes into their overall architecture to help streamline a lot of the processes they're doing currently. And then also, Grant brought up a good point, going from legacy to a modern architecture, right? A lot of our customers are saying, hey, we need to adopt containerized deployments or move to the cloud. Please help us on that front. And so I think from an industry standpoint, we're hearing that call and enabling flexible architecture models to be employed. So it can be much easier to be on a legacy environment today, but make that transition to a modern cloud adoption or a burstable containerized environment for managing their applications.
Thank you, Ted. Anything else anyone would like to add here before I call for poll question number 1? Okay, I'm going to ask for poll question number 1 to be up on our screen then, please. This is for our audience. We just want to hear from you all if you plan or are implementing your zero trust architecture, or if you're having discussions with key stakeholders about the strategy in the near future, if you haven't already. So please go ahead and respond to that. Again, if you want to receive your CP credit, you need to respond to all 3 of these poll questions. So on that note, Grant, you started talking about this earlier, so it's a great segue. I want to start with you here. Does the zero trust architecture work with legacy technology? And are there any specific hurdles that agencies and enterprises might face if they're using too much of that legacy technology?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a complicated question. As is often the case in this stuff, the answer is it depends. I think what is true is that certain pillars of the infrastructure need to change with zero trust. So, for example, having a zero trust I think it's fair to say it's not really possible to have a zero trust network built around the same identity provider that maybe you used in your on-prem network back in the early days. Not to say you can't do it with an on-prem identity provider, you absolutely can, but using the same kind of products that maybe were used in the past, using the same kind of sort of VPN style architecture with VPN concentrators running in a rack. Those are kind of sort of fundamental elements of the infrastructure that likely need to change. Now, in terms of applications, there are lots of ways and lots of tricks to integrate a legacy application into a zero trust architecture while maintaining some amount of compatibility. Now, it's not necessarily going to be as secure or as good as if you were to sort of engineer this from the ground up using modern application development processes, modern authentication protocols, modern, software developments and sort of supply chain risk management. All of that comes with some amount of re-engineering of the applications. But certainly it's possible to take a legacy system that you have a ton of investment in that you need to maintain in order for the mission to continue, and integrate that through various tricks with a more modern infrastructure foundation. And I think every organization, including ones in the private sector that are already on a zero trust architecture, have had to confront that kind of a challenge, and in some cases have seen success. So I think one way to think about it is to try and understand your legacy risk. I talk a little bit about, when we're doing this internally at CISA, putting the legacy in a box so that you understand that, yes, this legacy system has certain risks that go along with it. We can make it work in the environment we're building. That part of the environment, not necessarily as robust as other parts of the environment, but a compromise of that system is confined and can't move laterally to compromise the entire environment. So I think that's the kind of way to think about it. Now, obviously, if you have certain elements at the very core of your IT infrastructure that are not offering the capabilities you need to do things in zero trust, it may very well be necessary to replatform some of those core capabilities. But I think that's a different question than, do you have to get rid of all of your legacy, which I think everyone knows is impossible, right? No one is getting rid of all of their legacy. And it's a question of how you navigate that. So that's what I would say on that.
Thank you, Grant. I appreciate that response. Martin, is there anything you'd like to share on that topic?
That was a pretty comprehensive answer, but I think, to Grant's point, I think it really depends how legacy your technology is that we're talking about. Certainly, some of these really, really old, legacy applications, which are very, important to organizations, it might be hard because they just don't have, the ability to, limit access, different kinds of users and all that kind of thing. But generally speaking, right, zero trust is envisioned to be able to leverage existing capabilities and to fit into existing environments, with minimal, maybe a little bit of extra, acquisition, potentially of additional, tools, but it's more of, the way that you architect and engineer your environment. So I think, generally speaking, if you've got a, fairly new kind of environment, you should be okay. If you've got some pretty big legacy applications, things that talk on non-standard protocols, and you don't have the ability to segment traffic and things like that, then you're really looking at more of a modernization effort than just applying zero trust to your existing environment.
Thank you, Martin. And Bo, I would love to hear from you next. I also want to note we had an audience question come through. Maybe you can incorporate your thoughts around this as well. Robin Bashman writes in, would you suggest that the legacy architecture system is best removed by allowing it to exist? Are people allowing false security? So Bo, over to you.
That's a good question. And Grant really said it well when he said, it's a complicated question. So I'll just add that, in zero trust, zero trust is a concept, it's not a solution, right? So one of the challenges we face is how do you translate the concept into sort of an operational model that actually, that actually works and produces what it's supposed to. So there's really 3 domains when it comes to zero trust from an operational standpoint, or at least the way I view it. One is identity. We've talked about that quite a bit. And I think that's where federal agencies are the most comfortable because we've dealt with identity for such a long time and we understand the role it plays. With zero trust, identity of devices, it also plays a key role. And so organizations can do that with a certificate on the device. And we understand how to do device identity with device-based certificates. You can also do that with an agent running on the box to establish that unique device ID. And again, the key there is associate the unique device with the unique user. And that alone is a game changer from a cyber standpoint, right? Because you can have someone's username or password or what have you. If they're not on the right device, that's denied, right? And that's something we can't do today based on a traditional approach. But another domain is a data-centric security model. So encryption plays a role there, obviously, but things like DLP play a role where you're labeling data using the metadata of the data, right? And then you have policies to govern that data, what's allowed to do, where that data is allowed to go in the environment. So that's another one. But I think what we're getting at here is this middle domain, which is really SASE, right? SASE breaks down into 2 areas. One is a replacement for VPN. So users will connect to the cloud's edge using a SASE provider, which is really like an always-on VPN, right? So it's an improved user experience there, but then you're connected to the cloud's edge. Agencies and organizations have to map applications to that same edge so that the users can get to them. And so with identity, a lot of identity service providers know that we have a legacy challenge. And so they're adding legacy compatibility into their identity service. A lot of the SASE providers are adding legacy compatibility with their SASE solutions. And so organizations have the ability to map internal legacy applications to the internet gateway, if you will, of that SASE provider so that users can get at it. And you still have a location to place policies and enforce policy for that application. So you really improve security as well. So it's growing because, especially federal agencies, we need it, and then the vendors know that we need it, so they are working hard to add that to their products.
Thank you, Bo. And Ted, I want to hear from you next, please.
Sure. Yeah. So the age-old debate of supporting legacy applications and legacy technologies is always something that industry has struggled to deal with. The nice thing is that industry is starting to step up and address ways to support legacy technology. In fact, I see one of the questions here is discussions regarding API support. And that's really the methodologies that industry are taking to not only support legacy SIM tools and DLP tools, diving into and integrating with DevOps environments and issue tracking systems, but providing them a segue to continue to support those legacy solutions until they can adopt some modern approaches to, from our standpoint, we're looking mostly in DevOps and application security, how we can better automate and integrate into some of those modern tools that will streamline their zero trust strategy.
Thank you, Ted. And I am going to ask for the second poll question to go up on our screen. That being said, Ted alluded to it earlier. We've got a lot of audience questions come through, which is awesome to see. So panelists, I just want to make you aware of that if you want to incorporate any of these questions into your responses. That being said, poll question number 2 is up on the screen. So our audience at home, please take a moment to respond. Do you feel like your organization has a strong handle on its threat landscape and understands what it needs to secure? Please respond yes or no to that. So our next question that, Martin, maybe we can start off you with on this one is around culture, I believe. Well, there's 2 questions here. What are some tips for getting buy-in on zero trust architecture if there is resistance from everyday employees or even from developers? And along with that, we did have an audience question around the culture. So many have stated that zero trust architecture is as much a cultural pivot as it is technical. Do you agree with that? If so, what can we do in this space? Martin, if you'd like to answer either of those questions, please.
Sure. Thank you. I was really hoping I was going to get to answer this question first. So,
Hey.
so I feel like I won the lottery. So I think first of all on this topic, and this is one that, I spent a lot of time, talking with different kinds of folks about it, with different kinds of security, expertise, going from none to, having a whole lot. And, probably one of the core aspects of any kind of zero trust, just education, if you're getting certification or something along those lines, is talking about the evolution into zero trust capabilities within your environment being something that you need to put forth in, the terms of a business case. And, a lot of, security folks really work things from a compliance angle. But, you've got to think about, well, we've been spending all this money, we have, a certain orientation, and how do we leverage what we have? No, you're not going to go out and buy a zero trust solution, right? You're going to build capabilities that meet your security objectives. So, starting there, number one, you shouldn't be incurring a huge amount of cost, at least for, new tools and capabilities. You might be, incurring costs around engineering and architecture, with your IT staff, and even folks, as we mentioned on the mission side, they'll have to contribute, talk about, how, certain use cases are handled and what they do with data and how they need to access it and use it. To meet whatever they're trying to accomplish. The second thing is, and I took a couple notes here, but the user experience really shouldn't change much either, right? If anything, your user experience should hopefully improve. If your roles and responsibilities are well understood and the things that you have access to are well documented and well implemented, then you should have all the things that you need in your environment. And that should all, be fairly transparent to users. I think from the culture side, I don't know what the right answer is, specifically, because I'm not sure what's meant by culture. But what I'll say is, if the culture change is one in which you're adjusting the way that you use your IT resources so that they meet the needs of the users for the things that they're trying to do, and also protect the data and provide additional assurances to your stakeholders that the data that you're being trusted, the mission that you're going to execute is being managed in a much better way. Then in that case, it is a culture change if folks aren't used to doing that, or if that's not a priority already.
Thank you, Martin. Bo, would you like to respond next?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple examples at Census of how we, the culture challenges we dealt with, and then how we handled it. And one specific example, we were, and this is with our senior IT folks, right? The ones that we depend on for their expertise. And so as zero trust is introduced, everyone sort of tries to relate it to your comfort zone or your knowledge base, right? And I think zero trust is just a different animal, and that's one thing that makes it really difficult. Our network folks said, "Oh, we'll just segment very well. We'll do better, restrictions from network to network." And once you get into the details and you say, "Well, how are you using identity to do that?" And the network teams are like, "What do you mean? We don't do that, right?" And it's like, okay, then you're not doing zero trust. And so really getting them to kind of shift and to realize that identity is a key part of zero trust, even at the network layer, it was a hard adjustment for them. We worked through it. We had a lot of spirited conversations about that to try to get to that aha moment when we're saying, oh, this is more secure because we can use identity of devices and we can use identity of people, where we traditionally didn't do it. You need smart switches, smart gateways, and next generation routers and firewalls and so forth to do it. But again, the vendors are already there. So we just need to tap into these capabilities that vendors have already, established for us. So that was one IT cultural challenge. The other one was with our application developers. Typically, they just write their application to perform the functions that they need, and infrastructure takes care of the security and all the other things involved. But under zero trust, those things, again, that we're used to doing at the network layer are now moving up to the application layer, right? And so applications need to be identity aware. And again, identity meaning people, but also machine to machine communication. And so, application developers need to think in terms of how they're going to enforce those types of restrictions at the application layer. They also need to incorporate things like application gateways and application proxy, because under zero trust, everything happens sort of over the internet, and we're certainly not going to expose applications to the internet. So that's where the application proxies and application gateways come into play. And again, developers weren't used to that previously. So it takes a lot of detailed conversations and a lot of sort of subject matter expertise and creativity to kind of get people to realize how this is pretty dramatically different. And there's other examples too, because to the conversation earlier, the devil's in the details here. There's no such thing as a zero trust solution. There's a lot of pieces and parts that come together to make up the zero trust puzzle.
But this is just, if you don't mind me asking a question, because this is really interesting. You didn't try and eat the whole elephant at once, right? As you're talking about these challenges, you started off with a certain set of early objectives in mind, and then you built out capabilities, correct?
Yeah. And part of the conversation is helping those individual groups see the bigger picture, because everything plays a part in that bigger picture. Whereas before they could sort of be siloed and just do their piece. That's no longer the case, right? Applications are dependent on the identity provider. Network teams might be dependent on the identity provider if we're doing network-based zero trust, those kind of things. So it's really a different sort of dynamic.
Thank you, Bo. And Grant, love to hear from you next.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think they really covered it. I really, what both said really resonated for me. I'd say a couple things in addition. One is, I think from an end user point of view, outside of IT, I think there's in a well-designed zero trust implementation, there should be minimal to no negative impact and primarily a positive impact in user experience, because certain things that they had to do before, like sign into every application separately with a username and password that they wrote down on a sheet of paper and connect to their VPN every 8 hours or whatever. Those just don't happen anymore. But from an IT point of view, there is a big culture change, because in some cases, it's a merger of separate silos within IT, such as networking, security, identity management. In the government, at least, is often a separate thing, although in a lot of organizations it's sort of bundled in with IT operations in many respects, and there's some mergers there that need to happen. The other thing that I would, or at least collaboration to understand the new model. The other thing that I would say, from an application point of view, zero trust really demands, at least when you're really trying to go in and do the application parts of it, as opposed to manage legacy, more of an enterprise approach to software development. So for example, investing in enterprise services for source control, enterprise services for delivery, cloud services that have intrinsic non-person identity capabilities, for example, certificates or tokens that are automatically managed and associated with particular workload objects, whether it's a container or a function or a VM or whatever. Those constructs are enterprise constructs, and the idea that every application can be different and have no similarities and just be sort of developed by the developers however they like and dropped into the network is not as effective. And so to really do this, given that more is going on at the application, because it has to be more intelligent about like access, that's a lot easier if you take more of an enterprise approach to application development and really invest in providing shared services. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that IT has to do everything, right? There are very valid ways to organize this where a set of capabilities are provided and control is pushed down into the organization to leverage those capabilities. And exactly what model one takes depends on a lot of factors involving the culture of the organization and risk tolerance and things like that. But I do think that it's not a requirement to do zero trust, to come back to the legacy conversation, and there are certainly network-based approaches that can be taken. But for new stuff that one is building out and as part of modernization, looking at providing those kinds of capabilities certainly makes things easier going forward. So I would add that data point to the cultural transition of again more of an enterprise approach to infrastructure that supports application development.
Thank you so much, Grant. And Ted, would love to hear from you next on this.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. So we take a little bit of a different approach based on what we've been seeing, which is more of a involve every aspect, every level of the organization when you start introducing new concepts and especially zero trust into the organization. A lot of our enterprise customers who have adopted something like the Center of Excellence methodology, where they're consolidating all of their data centers and then obviously all their decision making in terms of enterprise tools, it becomes a very drawn out process because it ends up, in some instances, tools are being forced upon end users who are not comfortable or not ready or not happy that their end user experience might change. So we've seen much better results from our organizations who have involved every level of the organization throughout the decision-making process, where the end users understand that these are the tools that we're looking at, how it's going to impact their environment, and eliminate any surprises and change to how their daily environment is. And I think, again, the zero trust approach does a very, very clear definition. We've talked a lot about applications here in terms of integrating and automating application security directly into software development that will improve the collaboration between the application security team and the DevOps team and those engineers who typically don't communicate that well. I think we can all agree there, right? So to improve their collaboration is going to help remediate problems faster, release cycles will improve, ATOs will come faster. And so again, involve everyone throughout every step of the process as you implement a zero trust methodology.
Thank you, Ted. We had a couple questions come through around funding. Maybe we can tackle those. Paul Robinson wrote in, how do I receive funding to meet the end goal of AI provisioning absolute trust? And then another question from, I saw it earlier, now I can't find it. Let's see. We have so many audience questions come through, which is awesome. It just makes it hard for me to keep track of all of them. Anyone want to jump in on questions related to funding? I believe the other one I was looking for was something around where do you start if you haven't been able to receive the funding necessary for that zero trust architecture?
Kirsten, I touched on that in the previous answer. Thinking about it from the perspective of putting a business case together, I think that's probably the best thing to do. And if you don't know how to do that, I think that's probably a good time to find someone within the organization that does, or go work with some kind of training. Certainly we're not supposed to promote any particular vendors here, but it's definitely available out there, and you don't really have to do anything that's over the top as far as, business case goes, but making sure that you identify what kind of investments are needed and what the gain is to the organization is probably a good place to start. And if you can do it in plain English, it's even better. With numbers.
Yeah, that's a good point, Martin. I would also add IT has a life cycle. We know that some organizations are slow, some are faster, some have more money, some have less. My recommendation is to tie, if you're a federal agency, you're obviously working on a cloud transition. Cloud service providers are building more and more zero trust capabilities natively into their cloud services. And then third-party vendors are also making their services more cloud native as well. So as you transition to the cloud, make sure you enable some of the zero trust capabilities as part of that. And the other thing I'll say is zero trust is an IT system design priority. It's not a security design priority, right? I'm not going to design the census cybersecurity program on using zero trust. I'm going to design each IT system to implement a zero trust model for the IT system. And then security is obviously a key benefactor of that.
Yeah, just one other thing to throw in there. I mean, I think, you have to make it a business case. You have to tie it to IT priorities. I think at the executive level, for a government agency, right? I mean, this transition is flagged by ONCD as among the top, if not the top, cybersecurity priority, for agencies. And obviously, the budgets in the government take a while to roll over, and things like that make it a little challenging. But I think there is a decent amount of money that is being invested in IT O&M and IT life cycles in general that can often be oriented to sort of pick away at this problem and make progress. I am certainly well familiar with the challenges of funding key things here, but often you're able to find solutions. If you can get executive consensus that a particular step is the right thing to do, there's usually ways to make progress. Once you have that business case and you have the necessary level of executive support to move forward.
Thank you, Grant. Anyone else?
I'll just jump in really quick from an industry standpoint. Of course, what we're regularly asked, and you always ask of industry, is give me a solid return on investment that's going to help with my budgeting and funding, right? So getting a solid ROI business plan from industry is obviously important, but also taking into account, I think, a lot of the intangible costs of making changes related to zero trust in terms of automating processes and integrating new solutions into your software development. That's going to save you on budget as well. So if you combine the ROI with the intangible costs, I think it'll open up budget for you to start adopting a more zero trust strategy.
Ted, would you recommend starting like with your existing vendors? I mean, I know, from a vendor perspective, we're not going to talk about any specific vendors, but I know from a vendor perspective, a lot of vendors are playing defense, with their existing customer base to ensure that they don't get sold a bill of goods and they, dump their current solution when they could just have used the tool that they already had in a different way. Would you recommend, that maybe starting to talk with your existing, vendors to figure out how other customers are using the technologies that and maybe new capabilities that those vendors are implementing so that they don't have to go out and rip and replace stuff?
Yeah, really good point. The common thing that we're seeing is, especially when new CISOs are coming in, is that they're taking those 3-4 months to assess what tools they have currently. Can we use those? Can we leverage those? Or are they just too outdated to leverage those? But obviously innovation is key, right? Not every legacy solution or legacy vendor out there is going to be supporting containerized deployments or making cloud movements and adopting FedRAMP, for example. So you're going to have to be constantly looking at that innovation, but yes, certainly take a look at your existing solutions, see if they're the right fit, but align them with what the zero trust strategy is recommending in terms of, do they automate, do they integrate, And will they help us with our future goals for the overall network and the environment?
All right, great conversation. Thank you all so much. I'm going to call for poll question number 3. And in the meantime, panelists, please look over at some of the audience questions that have come through, and we'll try and tackle as many as we can before we run out of time. Poll question number 3 up on the screen. How critical is automation as part of your security strategy moving forward? Please go ahead and respond to that, and then we are done with our polls. So looking over at the audience Q&A, there was a few questions that came through around frameworks, and I'll pose the question from Kapil first. He asks, are we prepared for operational overheads and complexity while implementing zero trust frameworks? Would love to hear your thoughts. Anyone from the panel want to jump in on that? I see Bo came off mute. Bo, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common, I think, misperception that adding zero trust adds a bunch of congestion, right? But I don't see it that way because, and again, the reason I say that is because, you know, there's not an enterprise zero trust model. It's not a layered model where you have to negotiate many layers. You really have to focus on the resource, whether that resource is an application or whether that's a data set. And then you have a policy enforcement point in close proximity to that data set. And that's what folks have to navigate when they're getting access to that resource. And so there will be many of those policy enforcement points across the enterprise. Wherever you have valuable assets, there will be a PEP, right? But it's a very distributed approach. And that's why they say, you know, the perimeter goes away per se. I like to say the perimeter isn't relevant if you have zero trust correct. And so, you know, those policy enforcement points are really the key, and knowing that they are, you know, distributed across the environment. And I'm only dealing with the policy enforcement point that I need to deal with in order to get to the specific resource that I need to get to, again, whether that's a data set or an application. And so it's not as intensive as you might think.
Yeah. Grant?
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree with everything Bo said. I think, you know, one way to think about it is, you know, is really about moving the least trustworthy elements of your infrastructure, which are the endpoints that have people on them, where people are downloading files and navigating the open internet and stuff like that, outside of the security boundary of your environment, right? So it's not that there's still a policy enforcement point. There's still things on the other side of that policy enforcement point, which are the applications. Now, obviously, you know, part of zero trust is enhancing that side of the picture, but a good chunk of it is moving the users out of that and putting the users through this policy enforcement point. And I think that, you know, operationally, if it's implemented correctly and well, and is sort of designed, you know, in a careful way for an organization, it shouldn't really increase the operational burden for developers, for IT, for others. It'll change certain things, and there will definitely be friction points with certain technology. I mean, that's the legacy piece. But in general, you know, it's not like we're just imposing additional costs everywhere from an operational point of view. If I could, I wanted to answer 2 other questions in there that I think are related. One was the question about Kubernetes and containers, and then the other was the question about machine identity, because I think those are both critical elements. So look, Kubernetes is an approach to deploying applications. It is, you know, open source and supported by a number of vendors and relatively widely used at this point. It's reasonably complicated because it needs to support a lot of different requirements and use cases. It's not a magic solution by any means. However, it does provide an ability to do scalable, you know, deployment of a workload that can grow and shrink, and can provide, you know, more efficient use of compute resources, and also some platform elements that enable you to do interesting things from a security standpoint, like more easily assigning identities to workloads that you can then use to talk to other workloads to the machine identity point. So I think it's a useful tool. It's not the only tool, right? There's a number of other tools that are simpler to use that get after the same problem, but maybe not as customizable and maybe have other constraints, like they require you to be running in a particular vendor's cloud environment, and that, so there's lots of considerations there, but I think it's a useful thing to think about. And then I think, a lot of the conversation today has been about like the remote access piece of this, the identity piece for the users and their devices, the SASE element of it. Bo brought up a little bit the data side of this and the application sort of side of this. How do the applications talk to itself? How does things work on that side? In the real world, it's not like you have a single system that's every application. Applications talk to each other. We used to use enterprise service buses. Now everyone loves to talk about APIs and microservices, but there's always a use case for different systems talking to each other. And so those systems need to do that, not just in the context of like a person talking to them, but on their own terms. Even back in the old days, unconstrained delegation, things like that were service principles in AD. Those were widely used ways of getting at these same problems. And so machine identity is critical, and doing that securely is an important piece of this for sure. And especially in modern application environments. So I think that was a good flag by the commenter, and I just wanted to echo that.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Anyone else on the panel want to give their comments based on what's just been said? Okay, we can jump into the next question then that I had pulled up. I thought this one was interesting. James Kovac writes in, OMB 2218 is mandating software vendors provide self-attestations that they are providing clean code to the agencies. With a zero trust methodology, a self-attestation is not sufficient, and agencies will need to validate the vendors. So how will the panelists agencies be addressing this particular challenge? Has your agency given this any thoughts from our government folks online?
Yeah, at Census, we're working on this, and so I think that there is a level of trust involved anytime we're purchasing software or hardware from the vendor community. And I believe reputation really leads the way there, and it should, right? And there are vendors who have lost their reputation and they've suffered for that. So the nature of the business is going to require software vendors to act in good faith when it comes to dealing with the government and publishing that attestation. But again, I think this is a first step of many. I believe it will strengthen over time, but there's no way that the federal government's going to chase after every software vendor to confirm that they're following the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. We don't have the capacity to do that. It's hard enough for us to do that internally with our organizations, and so we're going to be dependent on that attestation. But again, when that proves to be wrong, the company is going to suffer from that. So they're going to have to take that seriously. And then, of course, agencies, there's a lot we can do for due diligence internally to make up or mitigate the risk associated with this as well. And that's coming as well. And if you read that full memo, it gives agencies a lot of flexibility to handle the relationship with vendors however we see fit from a risk management standpoint, because it says if they don't have the attestation, then agencies can really work with them and do whatever makes sense for them based on the situation. So again, that sort of applies regardless. We need to, we can't place too much value on something like an attestation. We still have to do that risk management model that we're required to do anyway.
Thanks, Bo. All right, we're playing Power Hour here. So if there's any questions in the Q&A chat that really stand out to you all, please come off mute and we'll get those answered before we run out of time. But there's a lot of conversation happening in the chat, which is great. Ted, is there anything else that you would like to address from the industry side?
I'll definitely follow up on the software attestation discussion. From an industry standpoint, yes, they're looking for us to be transparent, right? Do we follow agile software development methodologies? Yeah. Are you going to take our word for it? You shouldn't. But we're going to do our best to be transparent and demonstrate of how we're building our software and where our code is coming from and that we're doing it securely. But the nice thing is there's also other technologies out there that are available, like software composition analysis, that can give you details and transparent views into the origins of, say, open source code that is being used predominantly in a lot of vendors as they build their solutions. So you know the origins of that. I mean, who built the open source code, right? You can't trust that either. So using new technologies that are going to help you further validate the transparency of vendor software, I think will be a huge benefit going forward.
Thank you, Ted. Anyone else from the panel would like to comment before we?
I'll just chime in with, those are areas, software assurance, SBOM, things like that, that we're actually promoting a lot of applied research in as part of our portfolio in conjunction with folks in the cybersecurity division at CISA. So if you look on our website, you'll see all the different projects that we have going on in this area.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. Bo, you came off mute. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I know that the federal government's working to add language to the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And so that's where the teeth are going to end up for this requirement. So we'll see how that works out as well and how far that'll take us.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This has been such a great conversation, and we're almost out of time. So I want to give each of you a moment to share your final thoughts, what your key takeaway from this discussion has been, and anything you want to really leave our audience with before we end this panel here today. So first of all, thank you all so much again for your time. Grant, let's start with you. What's been your key takeaway from this 1 hour webinar discussion?
Yeah, so I thought it's been a really good discussion, really good mix of perspectives on different, topics that are of relevance. Hopefully the audience, found it helpful. We ranged from sort of very, practical suggestions on specific topics to some broader topics on philosophy. I think, the thing I want to leave folks with is, we, from our vantage point at CISA, we've been tasked with helping agencies to execute on the policy that has come down from the White House in this space, and we're really we're trying to do our best at that. We recognize that we have a lot of different programs and other things, and sometimes they take some time to change, and we recognize that because there's so many different interlinking elements of the policy space, sometimes it takes time for stuff to align. Budgets catch up, different policy might be in conflict with other policy, and agencies have to sort of deal with all of that. And I just wanted to leave people with we get that, right? We think this is a really important strategic transition. We think it's important, like Bo was talking about, to identify ways to move forward in specific areas that are aligned with your general IT modernization strategy, cloud, things like that, and not think about this as just another layer of security that I need to buy and bolt onto my infrastructure, because we really think that is a core part of the challenge that we have to break out of with this big shift. And it's not easy, right? We understand that. No one is going to be perfect about it. We understand that too. And it's really, trying to navigate those interlocking constraints as best as we can. So I think that would be my closing thoughts.
Thank you so much, Grant. And Martin, love to hear from you next.
Sure. Well, zero trust is not a destination, just like, any kind of security, and, there's no real end game, right? There's a, strategy and approach. And that's what we're really talking about here, is changing your mindset and your approach to securing your infrastructure. And hopefully, if you're able to communicate it well, all of your stakeholders will understand all the benefits, particularly when it comes to protecting data and ensuring, the right folks have access, and folks that shouldn't have access to things don't have access.
Thanks, Martin. Over to you next, Bo.
Yeah, I would recommend picking one application or one data set, right? One specific use case to convert to zero trust. If you can do that in alignment with a cloud migration of that application, even better, because it becomes an exercise of identifying those cloud native capabilities or those third-party cloud optimized solutions that enable those zero trust capabilities on that case-by-case basis, because it's truly as a case-by-case approach for zero trust. It is not an enterprise approach. So don't try to go down that path. It's just an exercise in frustration, but that's what I would say.
Thanks, Bo. And Ted, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to thank the panelists for all the comments today. It's been very enlightening for me as well. I appreciate it. But, in closing, zero trust started with not trusting the end user, right? And I think there's a lot of focus. We've got agencies and customers that are in different areas. They've got their two-factor, non-trusting identities in place. And now they're looking more towards how do we better control and not trust the networks and devices and, of course, applications. And once they reach that point, I think both the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model and the DoD roadmap have done a really good job in defining how automation and integration of your application security into software development will be a huge benefit of introducing zero trust concepts. Not only streamlining their processes, getting them to ATOs faster and release cycles faster, but also controlling budget, right? Letting the resources do more with less. And we know how good resources are hard to find. But even taking it a step further, giving our customers better visibility into their overall risk posture going forward is really well outlined. If you look at the DoD roadmap, visibility and enterprise dashboards are extremely important. So they know that they're compliant and taking advantage of those. And then look at the big picture of how you want to orchestrate the entire zero trust solution, right? Have a plan, again, involve all aspects of the organization so you don't have infighting. And I think you'll get to that path much, much faster.
Thanks, Ted.
If I could, I just wanted to say one 10-second thing that Bo triggered me on, just to make sure that I'm not in conflict with what he said. So he made a really critical point, which is go after this case by case, work on a case by case. Earlier, I had identified certain enterprise services that I thought were important. It's critical to understand those are supporting not the entire zero trust for everything. Those are supporting elements that can be leveraged by the bulk of certain pieces, but you have to approach it case by case. Not to say there's no enterprise supporting services, there are, but those two things are very compatible with each other. And I realized the way that it was phrased may have left people with that we were disagreeing. I don't actually think we are. I think we're saying the same thing, just from different points of view. So I just want to make sure that was extra clear.
Great. Thank you all so much. Actually, we're going to take a screenshot real quick. So smile, 3, 2, 1. Cool. Thank you all so much. Thanks everyone at home for the great questions and engagement. We're really happy to have you here and online, and of course Invicti for being our sponsors today. Question number 4. Okay, I lied before. We have a 4th poll question, but it's just to say whether or not you want your emailed CPE credit to you or not. So that being said, our next event up on the screen is February 8th. It's ATARC's 2023 Federal IT Modernization Summit. So if you feel like coming in person, we're going to be downtown Marriott Metro Center February 8th. Would love to see y'all there, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye.